The final 5 verses in the Gospel of Matthew, the final 5 tell us that a faithful remnant of Jesus' followers, 11 disciples in total. 11 was all that was left out of the thousands that Jesus touched, healed, fed, helped, loved. 11 people, 11 men, 11 disciples climbed a mountain in Galilee where they had an encounter with the living God, the resurrected Christ. Go, he said to the 11. 11. That's less than we have in our pews today. Go, he said, go with the powers of heaven and earth on your side and make disciples of every nation. Teach them to obey the commandment that I have given you. The commandment to love God with all your heart and soul and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And so they went out into the world without possessions. They broke the heart of their mothers and fathers who thought that surely now that the leader of that crazy Jewish cult had been crucified, perhaps these young followers would come home. But they didn't. They went out into the world, and the world responded to their love by martyring them, imprisoning them, mocking them, torturing them, killing them. And despite the powers that acted to oppress God's love, the people came. People came to the disciples in secret. People came by the thousands with hungry souls and hopeful hearts to be baptized by them. And the newly baptized became disciples, and soon the ministry of Christ grew. And we like to say, starting on that day 2,000 or so years ago, it grew from 11 to the 2.54 billion people registered as Christians today. But I don't think that that's true. Not really. Not really, because somewhere along the way, we disciples of Christ screwed up. We messed up. We heard Jesus say, go out and make disciples of all nations, and we thought that our job was to make Christianity popular. So we built churches, and we got amazing choirs, and we hired pastors and big bands, and we had great programming, and the people came. I've seen the pictures from 1950s Windermere. 3 services on a Sunday, 300 children on the Sunday school roll, and a lineup around the block to get in. And we preached, honor thy mother and father, and that was good. And we preached charity for the poor, and that was good. And we preached, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And that was good. But rarely, if ever, did we dare to use Luke 14:25-33, following Christ even at the cost of family possessions and personal safety, as the text for New Members Sunday. Because we didn't want to scare anybody off. So and I count myself as guiltiest of the guilty parties in this, we watered down the good news story with a healthy dose of what Dietrich Bonhoeffer calls cheap grace. In his book, The Cost of Discipleship, Bonhoeffer, writing in World War II Nazi Germany, says, cheap grace. Cheap grace is the pastor preaching forgiveness without requiring repentance, offering baptism without church discipline, communion without the need for confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ. Costly grace, on the other hand, comes to us like it did to those very first disciples, as the word of forgiveness when the spirit is a broken spirit and the heart is contrite. And it's costly because it compels a person to submit to the yoke of Christ and follow him. And it's grace. It's grace because it turns out that once you submit to the divine potter's hands, the yoke is easy, the burden is light. And that is the beauty and the paradox of Christian grace. Once you leap in faith into God's arms, all the painful cracks, the lonely brokenness are molded on the potter's wheel into a wholeness that enfolds all pain and agony into an expansive vessel of love. And on that day, so long ago, Jesus stood before the crowds. Luke says there were thousands of them following him. And Jesus spoke about the cost of discipleship. He wanted people to know what they were signing up for. Do we do that? He wasn't worried about growing the church or making Christianity palatable or popular. He was making disciples. Disciples who knew that saying Black Lives Matter might cost you a family member who struggles with white fragility. Disciples who knew that caring for the poor might mean making decisions at the ballot box that take a little money out of your pocket. Disciples who knew that the planet on fire meant that they had to become firefighters. I spent the first and last 3 days of my sabbatical alone in a cabin by the woods on a property called Abbey North. A 10-minute drive away is Abbey Gardens. And Abbey Gardens is the mission site of a former United Church of Canada minister, John Patterson, and his wife, Taya. About 10 years ago, Abbey Gardens was 388 acres of scarred landscape, a spent open-pit quarry, the dry, dusty bones of Mother Earth, broken by backhoes, left to regenerate on her own. And Taya and John had a vision of the Spirit blowing dry bones into flesh once more, so they bought the quarry, and they began to love it back to life. And it made me think of the church. And it made me think of a man who years ago told me that I was foolish to become a minister. Why would you want to work in palliative care, he said. Don't you know the church is dying? And I replied, I have no interest in holding the hand of a dying church. I believe in resurrection, don't you? And maybe the church we know is dying. 2,000 years ago on a hillside, Jesus preached to thousands, and by the time he died, there was 11 disciples, a faithful remnant. And they didn't worry about making Christianity popular. They went about making disciples who loved God with all their heart and soul and mind, and who loved their neighbors so much that they were willing to die for them. But at least before they died, they knew what it was to truly live. And while others around them were spoken to in parables, Luke tells us that the faithful remnant knew the secrets of God's kingdom. They dined at Christ's table. They were sustained by the Spirit's companionship. Like clay in the potter's hands, when we submit to being molded by the divine, personally or communally, our lives take on unimaginable beauty. I've seen that beauty in the gardens that cover an old gravel pit in Halliburton. I've seen that beauty in the ways the disciples in this church live out the call to love their neighbor, and I have seen that beauty as recently as 6 days ago in my own life. It happened on Tuesday as I sat in family court watching the Honorable Judge Scully sign the adoption papers for Cassandra, Dharma, and Jacob. Now, some say that becoming an adoptive family is like a trial by fire. And I say it's a lot like a potter's wheel. You have to let yourself be molded by God's love, shining through, even on the trauma days. There are things you have to shed. There are new shapes you have to become. You have to submit to the process of being molded into the parent that your children desperately need you to be. On Tuesday evening, I posted photos on Facebook of our Forever Family Day, and a friend who was also an adoptive mom said, "Your photos made me cry. When I first met Cassandra, she rarely smiled or showed any emotions at all. Over time, I saw her shyly smile more and more. The smiles seen on Tuesday, these beautiful smiles, well, they light up the world." Despite what popularity Christianity will tell you, we aren't called to live comfortable lives. We are called to be disciples. We are called to go out into the hurting world and let the potter's hand shape us into the people and the church that our families, our communities, our planet need us to be. There are new shapes we have to become. There are things we have to shed. But never forget that grace, not that cheap kind, but Christ's grace, that undeserved gift of unconditional love, acceptance, and support, makes the burden easy, the yoke light. All over the world, people are yearning for an invitation to discipleship, desperate to find meaning, aching to believe that their lives matter. That's why I know that God's church is not dying. It's resurrecting in the potter's hand. And oh, what a beautiful creation we are becoming. Amen.